Welcome back. This is part 2 to Cosmos, Chaos and the Kosher Mentality. Kosher Laws distinguishing clean and unclean creatures. We are the Ministry of the Real Truth, bringing it to you. 2.2. The hygienic explanation of why they don't eat certain animals, flying insects, etc. The belief that hygienic considerations underlie and explain the kosher rules is very attractive to modern readers from an era when healthcare and diet considerations are so prominent. The fact that this explanation finds a place in a textbook used to train health inspectors in Britain demonstrates the power of its appeal. The effects of the roundworm Trichinella spiralis and the tapeworm Tania solium were probably responsible for the ancient Jewish prohibition against the consumption of pork. Yeah, they're probably full of worms and all this sort of stuff. But we were told by a practicing Jew that it's because they're dirty, scummy, unclean animals. They roll around in muck, and then they poop and they eat their own poop. Whereas we found with Tacitus, the book of histories, that they were ousted because the pigs had some sort of plague like a leprosy or bubis or something, and the Egyptians looked at these supposed Israelites and says, well, they got this bubos or whatever it is in the Egyptian disease in their groin, in their loins, and the oracle said, well, you know, if these pigs of theirs, these swine of theirs are infected with this disease, right, your people will probably get infected, you know, because they're not because they're going to eat them or anything like that, but because they're around, right, spreading that disease will spread. So get them out of there, right? So they did, okay? And that's why these supposed Israelites no longer ate the pig. Yeah. Okay. The conviction that sound physiological reasons lie behind these laws was expressed long ago by the medieval Jewish scholars Maimonides and R. Samuel ben Meir. Maimonides, I maintain that the food which is forbidden by the law is unwholesome. There is nothing among the forbidden kinds whose injurious character is doubted except pork and fat, but also in these cases the doubt is not justified, for pork contains more moisture than necessary for human food and too much of superfluous matter. The principal reason why the law forbids swine's flesh is to be found in the circumstance that its habits and its foods are very dirty and loathsome, as we stated. But if it were allowed to eat swine's flesh, the streets and houses would be more dirty than any cesspool, as may seen at present in the country of the Franks. Is that like the Germans? R. Samuel ben Meir. All cattle, wild beasts, fowl, fishes and various kinds of locusts and reptiles which God has forbidden to Israel are indeed loathsome and harmful to the body, and for this reason they are called unclean. Yeah, there's certain people that fry cockroaches and cover them in chocolate. Yeah, yuck. Not probably very appetizing to them, but just the mere thought of a cockroach covered in chocolate, no thanks. Okay, hopefully it doesn't come out as the latest candy bar trend, right? No thanks. It is noteworthy that Maimonides combines his hygienic theory with aesthetic considerations, and at the same time cocks a snook at Christian Europe. Okay, so he's giving them crap. Is that, it's like a thumb to the nose and a blah 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 taunting, right? Is it something like that? Among more recent scholars to espouse this explanation, the most influential is unquestionably W.F. Albright. You've heard of that guy. His starting point is as follows. After a long period in which anthropologists were accustomed to explain all such regulations as going back to totemism or animism, there is now a striking reaction. It is being increasingly recognized that men have always learned from experience and observation, especially in the ancient Near East. With this healthy redress of the early approach of Robertson, Smith and Fraser, this is William, don't know what his middle name was, Albright, yeah, we recognise this guy, proceeds to argue that it is to be expected that men should have learned through the centuries to distinguish between poisonous and non-poisonous serpents, mushrooms, etc. In particular, Albright draws attention to pork. They early learned the danger involved in eating pork, since trichinosis has been endemic in all Near Eastern lands from antiquity, from days of old. Some connections must have been recognised at an early date. Any doubt about this empirical approach, Albright argues, must be removed by the presence of the hard and the hyrax, of the hair and the hyrax in the list, since both are carriers of tularemia. Similar arguments are developed for the fish. Okay, and here's some references here. Fish without scales and fins such as eels are usually mud burrowers and therefore hosts to a great many more parasites than free-swimming fish. Yeah, I used to eat eels. Us Maori used to eat eels. Lovely. Smoked eel, beautiful. Right. Fried eel, yeah, beautiful. Yeah. We found them actually in estuary, like an open sea where we were living once. And you used to catch them by fishing line, and then they're also in this small pool. You'd catch them and then chop the head off, still attached to the line, throw it back in and get another one straight away. Yeah, they're slimy as buggers, you know. You have to give them a good clean before you chop them up, fried them and stuff. But yeah, smoking them was always great. Not smoking them as cigarettes, but yeah, putting them on a smoker. Imagine trying to get a cigarette paper around an eel, big fat eel. Okay, he detracts, however, from this latter point by pointing out that this would only be true in water of slow-moving muddy rivers like the Nile. It is clear that Albright's approach can easily be extended to explain the laws distinguishing birds, the prohibition of contact with the unclean, and the ban on eating blood. However, despite the apparent comprehensiveness of the hygienic explanations, two insurmountable criticisms can be brought against it. The first is that the text contains nothing which is remotely related to hygiene. In Britain, cleanliness may once have been next to godliness, but this aphorism sheds no light on the biblical concept of holiness. The second criticism is that there is no reason to suppose that the Israelites, either before or after the exile, believed that the unclean creatures were more dangerous for human consumption than the clean animals. The remarks of Philo of Alexandria suggest that the very opposite is true. Now, among the different kinds of land animals, there is none whose flesh is so delicious as the pigs, as all who eat it agree. And among the aquatic animals, the same may be said of such species as the scalers. Species leg, the station probably 4101. Observations like this make it most unlikely that early Israelites consciously rejected the unclean because they were known to be dangerous to a person's health. Finally, it should be noted that some unclean animals, such as the camel and the horse, are not dangerous for human consumption. These days they may be, and the milk they give may be. It was some sort of disease, 1998, 2000, something like that we found on the WHO list. Okay. Finally, it should be noted that some unclean animals, such as the camel and the horse, are not dangerous for human consumption. So if you're riding a horse through the desert and it suddenly dies and you're hungry, well, you just cut it up and cook it, right? Whereas some of the clean are potentially unsafe. Thus, if the hygienic explanation were really correct, we might expect the Israelites to have been vegetarians. 2.3. The ethical explanation. The ethical explanation takes due consideration of the relationship of the kosher rules to the call to Israel to be a people holy unto Yahweh. In this school of thought, holiness is equated with ethical purity. The author here discusses the validity of this below, but first, we discuss it, but first let us note that the adherents of this tradition can be roughly divided into two camps. 1. Those who see the kosher laws as allegories of virtues and vices. 2. Those who see the kosher laws as meaningless and arbitrary because their purpose is disciplinary and not doctrinal. The first group has an ancient pedigree reaching back to the letter of Aristeas, which was written in Alexandria around 150 to 100 B.C.E. The work is placed in the reign of Ptolemy II, Philadelphia, 287 to 247 B.C.E., and sets out to legitimate the new Greek version of the Hebrew Scriptures. It contains a defense of the kosher laws, Ep. Artis 130 to 71. Maybe that's like a epistle of Aristotle or something. I'm not really sure what that is. Given by Eleazar, the high priest in Jerusalem, in answer to the query why things are considered unclean. If God has made everything, two principles are expounded in the reply. 1. God hedged Jews in on all sides with strict observances connected with meat and drink and touch and hearing and sight, to ensure that Jews are distinct from Gentiles. Ep. Arist 142. 2. The whole underlying rationale is directed towards righteousness and righteous human relationships. Ep. Arist 169. The allegorical method, which would have appealed to potential readers in Ptolemaic Egypt, is marshalled in support of these principles. Hence the distinction of the birds teaches that tyranny is wrong. Ep. Arist 145 to 47. The Jew should imitate the gentle behaviour of the clean birds, which feed on plants and do not exercise a domination leading to the destruction of their fellow creatures. Human morals should not degenerate to the level of the unclean birds. Similarly, the parting of the hoof is allegorical of the separation between Jew and Gentile. Ep. Arist 153 to 57. All other unclean creatures are dubbed as mischievous. Ep. Arist 163. The case of the weasel is particularly interesting. It has another polluting feature, that of conceiving through its ears and producing young through its mouth. Ep. Artis 165. This bizarre folk physiology enables the author to equate the weasel with the gossip and the informer. The combination of the ethical explanation with the allegorical method of interpretation may have been popularized in Egyptian Judaistic circles by the letter of Aristeas. So that's probably what this is. Maybe epilogue of Aristeas or something. Certainly in the 1st century CE, Philo of Alexandria took up the same approach with relish in Spec Leg 4118. For Philo, the greatest threat to the virtuous life was an inability to control one's natural appetites. Therefore, in his view, the best foods were forbidden in the Torah, or the Book of Instruction, so as to discipline the most slavish of the senses, the taste. 4.100. In addition to this disciplinary purpose, Philo believed that the specific rules were allegorical. Thus, the legislation of regarding the birds was understood in the same way as in the letter of Aristeas. Carnivorous animals were prohibited, were not allowed, in order to teach Israel that it is not fitting conduct for sufferers to retaliate it on the wrongdoers. 4.103. Philo, however, understood the parting of the hoof differently from Aristeas. For him, it signified the ability to discriminate the correct way to act in the face of a number of choices. Rumination meant the ability to receive teaching by the learning process. 4.106 to 109. Fish without fins and scales were seen as symbolic of a pleasure-loving soul dragged down by lust. 4.112. And four-legged and many-footed land animals represented the base slaves not of one passion only, but of all. 4.113. Fish with scales and fins escaped the downward pull of lust. 4.110 to 1.215. There is no doubting the ingenuity of both Aristeas and Philo, but the dangers of the allegorical method are manifest. Quite apart from the fact that neither Leviticus 11 nor Deuteronomy 14 1-20 breathe a word of any of these ideas, it is a method which is difficult to control. This is because no single ethical system adequately explains the exclusion of all the creatures involved. Consequently, more than one explanation is needed, and thus the permutations proliferate. The technique is also at the mercy of the presuppositions of the exegete. Philo and Aristeas at the outset believed that God must have had very good reasons for disallowing or prohibiting the consumption of the unclean creatures, and therefore set their imaginations to work in finding unpleasant traits to justify the legislation. With sufficient determination, and beginning from the opposite standpoint, one could do something similar with the clean creatures. In other words, one can almost make the text say anything one wishes it to. Hence, Christians could interpret these laws as allegories of completely different virtues and vices for Philo and Aristeas. Down here, 63C, for example, Barn 1011, and J. Bunyan, Grace Abounding, paragraph 71 in the works of John Bunyan, Glasgow, 1866, I/1, page 40. Yeah. In view of these difficulties, it is understandable that a second tradition should emerge, which kept its distance from the allegorical method. Indeed, this school of thought either plays down or denies outright the notion that the kosher rules are allegories of virtues and vices, while still maintaining that the system as a whole has an ethical purpose. In 4 Maccabees, or Maccabees 4, which was probably written around 40 CE, in response to Caligula's attempt to have his statue erected in Jerusalem, we find the following statement placed upon the lips of a martyr during a dispute with Antiochus Epiphanes, who was trying to persuade him to eat pork. You scoff at our philosophy as though living by it were irrational, but it teaches us self-control, so that we master all pleasures and desires, and it also trains us in courage. It instructs us in justice, and it teaches us in piety. 4 Maccabees 5:22-25. The parallel with Philo is plain, but here there is no use of the allegorical method, nor is there any attempt to explain the specific laws. The same approach is to be found in the later rabbinical tradition. The precepts were given only that man might be refined by them. For what does the Holy One, blessed be He, care whether a man kills an animal by the throat or by the nape of the neck? Gen R 44:1. See also Leviticus R 1:3 or 13.3. Let not a man say, I do not like the flesh of swine. On the contrary, he should say, I like it, but must abstain, seeing that the Torah, the book of instruction, has forbidden it. Sephra 11:22. Subsequently, Jewish thought has followed this view, with some going so far as to argue that it is now impossible to uncover the original reasons for the specific laws, and others stressing that it is pointless seeking an explanation, since the rules are irrational, being given only to discipline Israel. The ethical explanation is a genuine attempt to come to grips with the correlation between the kosher laws and the call to holiness. Thus the ethical view stands or falls on whether holiness can be identified with ethical or moral purity. Milgrom has rigorously argued that it can. In his view, holiness is neither innate nor linked with animism, but the source of holiness is assigned to God alone. Holiness is an extension of his nature. It is the agency of his will. If certain things are termed holy, such as the land, Canaan, person, priest, place, sanctuary, or time, holy day, they are so by virtue of divine dispensation. The holy is the extension of God's will. That which man is not, nor can ever fully be, but that which man is commanded to emulate, or copy and approximate, is what the Bible calls kadosh, holy. Holiness means imitatio Dei, maybe that's Latin, the life of godliness. And this life of godliness is primarily about respect for life, which the dietary laws are intended to engender by restricting the access of Israel to animal flesh. The author then decided not to respond here to this last point, but restricted himself to two observations. First, Milgram's view of holiness does not adequately account either for those texts in which holiness is a contagious and transferable force, example Exodus 29:37, 26-29, or others which distinguish various degrees of holiness, Exodus 29:37, 30:29, and so forth. These texts alone serve to show that the Old Testament does not contain one view of holiness. Secondly, while one would not deny that Yahweh's call to Israel to be a people holy unto himself was the basis of certain ethical actions, it is nevertheless misleading to conceive of holiness as imitatio Dei. The remarks of Eichrodt are apt on this matter. The uniqueness of the Old Testament definition of holiness lies not in the elevated moral standard, but in the personal quality of the God to which it refers. The consciousness of standing in the presence of the Holy One had nothing to do with ethical motives. It remained purely a religious phenomenon. While this is an overt statement of the case, as Psalm 15 shows, it is nevertheless true that holiness is not primarily related in the Old Testament to ethics or moral perfection. Therefore, the ethical explanation of the kosher rules should be rejected, because it cannot be shown that the call to be holy in the legislation has anything to do with ethics. Mary Douglas, whose book Purity and Danger, an analysis of the concepts of pollution and taboo, combines a fresh examination of Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14:1-20 with a structuralist anthropological approach. Structural anthropology, which is primarily associated with Levi Strauss, not the guy, don't think the guy actually made genes. Okay, this might be a rabbi. Argues that the binary system by which the phonologist describes the sounds of language is more than a convenient method of description and generalization, but that it derives from the nature of the human mind. The structuralist holds that the human mind, functioning in this binary manner, making distinctions between high, low, heavy, light, soft, hard, and so on, produced and patterned not only the languages of the world, but also the social institutions and the systematic ordering of the natural world of humankind's environment. Douglas has approached the kosher legislation with the understanding that the Hebrews were no exception. They too attempted to classify their world, and therefore, she maintains, an analysis of the food laws should be undertaken against the background of such a classification. Commenting first upon the introductory clauses to the food laws, Douglas writes, there must be contrariness between holiness and abomination, which makes overall sense of all the particular restrictions. The importance of this becomes clear, she stresses, when we identify the principles of power and danger in the Old Testament, which are associated with the concept of the blessing. The blessing is the source of all good things, Deuteronomy 28:1-14, and its withdrawal is the source of danger, Deuteronomy 28:15-24. So if you're under the wrath and not a blessing, well, it's very dangerous. Obedience is the key to obtaining the blessing. From this she deduces that the positive and negative precepts are held to be efficacious and not merely expressive. Observing them draws prosperity, infringing them brings danger. The kosher rules should be understood in this light. Okay, so we're thinking about that, we're just thinking about that before. So if you follow that kosher dietary laws and you ate this and you ate that according to it, then sounds like you receive a blessing or the blessing, and if you don't follow it, well, you receive the opposite. Okay, and etc. Observing them draws prosperity, infringing them brings danger. The kosher rules should be understood in this light. We are thus entitled to treat them in the same way as we treat ritual advances whose breach unleashes danger to men. This is a universe in which men prosper by conforming to holiness and perish when they deviate from it. And there's some information here. Sources. Other sources. She then proceeds to investigate whether holiness means anything more than being set apart. Holiness, according to Douglas, is much more than justice or moral goodness. It also embraces other ideas such as wholeness and completeness. This is supported by reference to the qualifications for sacrificial victims. Leviticus 22:17-25, the purification of women, Leviticus 15:19-30, the separation of lepers, Leviticus 13:14, and the qualifications for the priesthood, Leviticus 21:5-6, 16-24. The correlation between holiness and completeness or wholeness is also identified in the laws regarding the warriors' camp, which had to be kept holy by preserving it from defilement by human emissions. Deuteronomy 23:10-15, EVV 9-14. In short, holiness was given an external physical expression in the wholeness of the body, seen as a perfect container. In the social sphere, the concept of wholeness is present in the laws, requiring that incomplete enterprises must be completed. Deuteronomy 25-7. It is also extended to species and must be completed. It is also extended to species and categories. Hybrids and other confusions are abominated, as is borne out by Leviticus 18:23, where sexual relations between man and beast are forbidden, and Leviticus 19:19, in which the mixing of cattle, seed or cloths is prohibited. That's creating hybrids, right? So Douglas concludes, holiness is exemplified by completeness. Holiness requires that individuals shall conform to the class to which they belong, and holiness requires that different class of things shall not be confused. Holiness means keeping distinct the categories of creation. With this understanding of holiness, she turns to the kosher rules in which the metaphor of holiness is developed. The kosher legislation deals, as we saw earlier, with the creatures in accordance with the elements in which they live: earth, water and air. Douglas argues that this threefold classification has been derived from Genesis 1, and that to each element is allotted its proper kind of animal life. Proper earth creatures possess 4 legs and hop, jump or walk. In the waters, scaly fish swim with fins, and in the sky 2-legged fowl fly with wings. Anomalies in classification are appealed to as the basis for uncleanliness. And here is some references to a book, the book called Purity. Any class of creature which is not equipped for the right kind of locomotion in its elements is contrary to holiness. Thus, anything in the water which has not fins and scales is unclean. 11:10-12. 4-footed creatures which fly, 11:20-26, are unclean. Any creature which has 2 hands and which goes on all fours like a quadruped is unclean. 11:27. This last point is alleged to be corroborated by the use of the noun in the Hebrew in Leviticus 11:27. Thus, she sees the list of land animals in Leviticus 11:29-30 as creatures endowed with hands instead of front feet, which perversely use their hands for walking. In terms of anomalous birds, she also tentatively suggests that the unclean may be anomalous because they swim and dive, that is, behave as denizens of the water. The swarming creatures possess an indeterminate form of motion and cut across the basic classification. Therefore, they are neither fish, flesh, nor fowl. Eels and worms inhabit water, though not as fish. Reptiles go on dry land, though not as quadrupeds. Some insects fly, though not as birds. There is no order in them. The prototype and the model of the swarming thing is the worm. As fish belong in the sea, so worms belong in the realm of the grave with death and chaos. In this way, then, Douglas applies the understanding of holiness as completeness to the kosher rules, such that her approach sheds light upon the distinctions which we studied earlier in this chapter. The results of the analysis make good sense of the laws as prohibiting contact with creatures which defy the order of the world that God has made. Some problems arise, however, that require some comment. The first problem is that, while the analysis provides an explanation for the main divisions, it does not account for the disqualification of the camel, hare, rock hyrax and pig as unclean. Douglas argues that here we should remember the sociological background of the Israelites, namely that they were probably like other pastoralists who do not relish wild game. Thus, the law of Leviticus 11:3, Deuteronomy 46 is understood as a posteriori generalization of the habits. This has some plausibility, however, the camel still remains puzzling. Houston's suggestion is helpful, namely that camel was not commonly used in Israel before the formulation of the legislation. But this last point is dependent upon his thesis that the custom of eating camel meat will only have come to the attention of Israelites about the time of the exile. A second problem is that the analysis does not explain why certain birds, which appear to be mostly birds of prey, are excluded as unclean. Impurity and danger. Douglas was in fact aware of this, but was unable at the time to offer a solution. This she had attempted in a more recent essay in which she extended her work to include the context of social relations in which the food laws had meaning. By doing this, she was able to offer a satisfactory explanation of the list of abominated birds. The essay Deciphering a Meal seeks to demonstrate that a meal encodes a message about the relations within a society, that is, about the different degrees of hierarchy, inclusion and exclusion, boundaries and transactions across the boundaries, the distinction between clean and unclean creatures is manifestly analogous to the distinction between Israel and the Gentiles. However, Douglas detects other analogies. The land and air creatures are further subdivided into three groups: abominable, fit for the table, set apart for the altar. The fact that in Leviticus the Hebrews only sanctified domesticated animals enables her to point to the analogy between Israel and Israel's animals, which is confirmed by rules such as the law of the sanctification to Yahweh of the firstborn, Exodus 22:29-30, etc., and the law of Sabbath observance, Exodus 20:10. Both these laws applied to the Israelite and his livestock. Thus she deduces the analogy by which Israelites are to other humans as their livestock are to other quadrupeds develops by indefinite stages the analogy between altar and table. Since Levites represent the firstborn of all Israel, Numbers 3:12 and 40, there is an analogy between the animal and human firstlings, or firstborns. Right? So another analogy is detected between the body and the temple. Israelites could not enter the temple if they became unclean, either through an issue of seed or blood, it's semen, right? Or through contact with an unclean animal, or through unsacralized killing of an animal. Leviticus 17, they didn't do it that merciful method, i.e. like in Islam it wasn't halal, is it? Was it haram? Yeah, it wasn't haram. Or through a physical blemish, Deuteronomy 23. Likewise, the Levite could not enter the sanctuary if he had a bodily blemish, Leviticus 21:17-24. Or if he had a contact with a corpse, he had contact with a corpse or a dead body, Leviticus 21:1-4, 10-12. Since the body and the temple are defiled by the same forms of impurity, it meant that the body and its rules could carry the whole load of meaning that the temple could carry by itself with its rules. At the level of the individual living being, impurity is the imperfect, broken, bleeding specimen. The sanctity of cognitive boundaries is made known by valuing the integrity of the physical forms. The perfect physical specimens point to the perfectly bounded temple, altar and sanctuary, and these in turn point to the hard-won and hard-to-defend territorial boundaries of the promised land. Israel is the boundary that all the boundaries celebrate, and that gives them the historical load of meaning. And here's an explanation here at the bottom. 92. Douglas, Deciphering a Meal, page 269. It is noteworthy that Douglas has rethought her understanding of blemish in a recent paper. The Forbidden Animals in Leviticus, JSOT 59, 1993, paragraph 3 to 23. Here the blemished are symbolic of those who suffer injustice, paragraph 19 to 20. And she utilises this understanding to explain why various vulnerable creatures were not eaten. However, her earlier understanding has greater plausibility, especially in view of the clear connection between holiness and wholeness demonstrated in Purity and Danger, her books. 93. Note also Amos 7:17, Hosea 9:3, and Isaiah 52:11, where the Gentile land is unclean. Closely related to this is Joshua 22:19, in which doubt is expressed about the Transjordan and the curious request of Naaman, the Syrian, to take back with him Israelite soil so that he might worship Yahweh in Syria. 2 Kings 5:17. And 94. Douglas, Deciphering a Meal, page 270. Having established the symbolic function of the kosher legislation, Douglas gives an explanation why the birds of prey are rejected, which is consistent with the traditional explanation put forward in the letter of Aristeas 145 to 48. The prohibition to eat and sacrifice birds of prey is a structural repetition of the general analogy between body and temple, viz. that birds that eat carrion which is undrained of blood are defiling. This explanation of the abomination of certain birds carries conviction and certainly formed the basis of later Jewish attempts to understand the legislation. And there's plenty more here. Okay, so the author then summarizes the analysis of the kosher rules put forward by Douglas in her book Purity and Danger and Deciphering a Meal. 1. Holiness incorporates the concept of wholeness or completeness. 2. The Hebrews believed that God had created a world with 3 distinct elements: earth, water and air, to which he had assigned suitable denizens. Anomalous creatures were rejected because they cut across the boundaries of this creation and hence transgressed the oneness, purity and completeness of God. The inclusion of hoof parting and cud chewing ungulates reflects the pastoral background of the Israelites. 5. The laws symbolizing the boundaries of the Israelite world: Gentiles, Israelites, priests. This is achieved by analogies between the unclean and the Gentiles, the clean animals and Israel, the Levites and the firstborn of clean animals, the altar and the table, the body and the temple. Hence, predatory animals are excluded. 4. Recent critique of Douglas and alternative explanations. It is not an exaggeration to say that Mary Douglas's work on Israel's dietary laws has changed the map for this field of biblical studies. Her explanation of the kosher legislation has received wide acceptance amongst biblical scholars, but not everyone finds it convincing. And here the author outlines some of the main criticisms of her explanation. Mention should first be made of the criticism of the anthropologist M. Harris, who represents the approach of cultural materialism. For Harris, Douglas is at fault for turning cooking into a language, making it food for thought. Such a conception, in his view, can only be seriously held among those who have never had to worry about having enough to eat. Harris's own contribution emphasizes ecological and demographical factors. However, while these will have provided some of the parameters of the food taboos, they can be utilized in a reductionist manner which rides roughshod over cultural factors, and Harris's approach does not avoid these pitfalls. And one of the strengths of Douglas's work is her insistence that we understand the laws within the social context and culture of Israel and post-exilic Judaism. More serious criticisms of Douglas's theory are related to a concept of anomaly in connection with proper locomotion in each sphere. This is, as we have seen, most vulnerable in relation to the legislation surrounding unclean birds, and hence she supplemented her thought with other factors in the essay Deciphering a Meal, extending an anomaly to incorporate anomalous behaviour. Her theory has also been challenged in respect of her interpretation of swarming things as those which cut across the basic classification. First, the argument that the swarming thing in Leviticus 11:29-30 are creatures which perversely walk upon their hands is based upon an incorrect translation of this Hebrew word as hand, Leviticus 11:27. As Carroll points out, the Hebrew term in question really refers to the palm of the hand of a hand or the sole of a foot, and hence the text more naturally describes animals that have pads on their feet, for example wolves, lions, bears, etc. Secondly, Firmage notes that it is not the case that the swarming things are automatically excluded because they swarm. His evidence is incontrovertible. In Leviticus 11:10, the prohibited or unallowed aquatic species are only a subset of everything that swarms in the water. And in Leviticus 11:21, the category of airborne swarmers includes the clean species of locusts. Houston identifies two further problems. The word seres does not define a group according to mode of propulsion, and no equation is made between seres in different spheres. Houston is, however, aware that in some contexts, his Hebrew word here, does not have connotations of movement in respect of creatures confined to the ground, but argues that this connection does not work with the water creatures because the verb, in the Hebrew here, is utilised for fish as well as other aquatic creatures in Genesis 1:20-21 and Leviticus 11:46. It is difficult to avoid Houston's conclusion that there is no basis for holding that this Hebrew word identifies a group of creatures that by their mode of movement cross boundaries between the elements and are therefore unclean. There are serious criticisms, and they form the primary basis for the rejection by Firmage and Houston of Douglas's theory that an anomaly underlies the kosher legislation. Below, the author has made clear that he is not entirely convinced that they have adequately refuted Douglas. Here, however, he decided to briefly summarise their alternative explanations and offer a few criticisms. Firmage's explanation is an interesting variant of cultic explanation, which was discussed earlier. However, rather than seeing the unclean as creatures venerated by non-Israelite cults, Firmage argues in the other direction. The criteria which enable identification of the clean are derived from the animals utilised in the Jerusalem cultus. The handful of species proper for God's altar table provide the required definition of cleanliness for the rest of the animal world. In this way, Firmage alleges that the priesthood transformed a socio-economic preference for domestic cattle into a key element of its religious institution. The driving force behind this novel consideration was surely the notion that Israel was called to be a holy people. At least we can say that this form of imitatio Dei, what's that, like Italian or Latin for godlike or deity imitation, does take seriously the observation noted earlier that Yahweh restricts his food to clean animals and birds. These references here. 106 in Genesis 1:25-26, this Hebrew word here in the Hebrew is used in an identical sense to this one, to creep or to crawl, and in Leviticus 11:29-30 it seems to take the place of this one here. Okay. So we'll end that there. We may have a part 3 to this. If you like this video so far, that's really opening your eyes, giving you insight to the Israelite or the Jewish kosher laws, then subscribe with us and add your comments below. Tell us all about it. Give us your views. We'll get back to you on those as soon as we can. because often we find them very interesting. There's things that you know that we don't know, okay? Especially in relation to the kosher laws, dietary laws, etc. So we are genuinely interested because we can learn from you, right? And others who know what they're talking about, who are well versed in it. As long as it's not too technical and it's at a level that we can, plain English and easy English so we can understand. Don't get all technical and jargon, like a computer technician or a Linux nerd, because we won't have any clue what the hell you're talking about. Okay, so if you found it interesting, eye-opening, whatever, give us a like, and then go share this video with all your friends, family, etc., who may have some knowledge about the Jewish dietary laws, kosher rules, etc., but got a few things wrong. This may give them better insight, right?